So 4 years ago in 2020, I made a video recommending six Trinidadian books, and I was like, this is going to be the start of a new series, the start of something new. Hello, I'm going to be uploading like a new video in this series like every few months recommending more Trini books, and I never did. Part 1 is still part 1. I have no part 2 yet until now. Okay, we're fixing it from today. I have enough books to make at least 2 more parts if we're just talking about like fiction novels, probably more if we talk about like non-fiction, but I don't think I'm going to get into non-fiction just yet. For now, we'll just focus on the novels. Okay. So I have 6 more books by Trini and Tobagonian authors here that I would like to recommend to you all. All of the videos will be in a playlist called TNT book, something like that. You'll see the playlist, I'll link it. And hopefully by the end of the year, there'll at least be like 3 to 4 videos in the playlist, so you'll have like a good set of videos to go to if you want some recommendations for books that take place in Trinidad. Anyway, sorry for this long intro, let's just get straight into the recommendations. The first book I have to talk about is a young adult novel, and it actually takes place in Tobago. It's the only book that I read that takes place in Tobago. It's called Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Das. This is a YA romance that is meant to be somewhat of a retelling of Persuasion, or loosely based off of Persuasion. Our main character, 17-year-old Reina, is the daughter of a man who owns a resort in Tobago. And then one day, an old flame comes back to Tobago and decides to stay at the resort with his very famous and well-known social media musician type friends. And so Reina is naturally having a crisis, especially when her father assigns her with the responsibility of taking him and his friends around the island to play tour guide. So what unfolds is Reina kind of coming to terms with this relationship, but also coming to terms with the grief that she has been feeling since her mother passed away, anxieties about her future and where she wants to go, where she wants to head with her career and her passions, as well as her relationship with her dad and the family business and the resort. It's a really, really lovely story. It wasn't really so much for me. It's not really my vibe. I don't really like books that are too heavy on the romance, but if you do like YA romance and YA contemporary, I would highly recommend this one. It is so good for that specific genre, and it is one that I think touched on a lot of really interesting issues and that I really, really enjoyed. Side note, if you read this book and you want more spoilery detailed thoughts, Paige and I did a live show for this for Bashment Book Club. Linnell wasn't there that day, so it was just Paige and I, and it was a really, really great discussion over on her channel. I will link it in the cards up above. That video, as well as a few other videos related to like Trinidad stuff that aren't part of this series, I have in another playlist called Trini related content. So local bookstores, maybe other book reviews or recommendations, and basically a whole bunch of live shows. You could go and check out that playlist for more Trini content. Hello, okay, we being patriotic. The next book I have to recommend is Hungry Ghosts by Jared Hosein. I recommended his YA novel in the first installment of this series. I love this man's writing. He has this way of just giving you these gloomy and mysterious and tension-filled atmospheres. His books are the kind of books where when you crack into them, you are not sure if you're reading like a dark contemporary or historical novel or plain horror, because the way that he writes and the way that he creates his setting, it gives you that really sort of spooky, moody vibe. This book in particular is set in the 1940s, and it follows an Indo-Trinidadian family who are basically struggling in poverty until the father finds an opportunity to work for this very rich woman who is the wife of a very rich man who recently went missing. Lots of creepy things are happening. Dogs are being killed as like warning signs. The book is just full of a lot of mystery. Like, you crack it open and you don't know what's going on, and you feel very intrigued until the very end. I will say, like, halfway through the story, it did feel a little bit disjointed for me, but for the most part, it was brilliantly written. It was this gloomy and atmospheric story that really explores the life of working class Indo-Trinidadians and barrack life at this particular point in history. It is so good and such an insightful read, and Jared Hosein is just a must-read if you want to get into Trinidadian literature. Obviously, I want to include books in this series that take place in the diaspora as well, so the next 2 books actually take place in the Canadian diaspora. The first is Polar Vortex by Shani Mootoo, whose other book, Valmiki's Daughter, I recommended in the first installment in this series. I've read like 4 of her books, and she still has more books, so she'll be like a regular occurrence in this series. This one in particular, though, takes place from the perspective of a woman named Priya, who's in her 60s and is in a relationship with a woman. They've been married for some years, and their relationship is basically kind of falling apart, and this story is essentially a look at how that relationship is crumbling, especially when someone from Priya's past comes and infiltrates in a way and sort of escalates this inevitable process of their relationship crumbling. And it is such a fantastic read that really delves into the blurriness of queer identity and the complexity that comes with that, and how nothing is ever straightforward, no pun intended. It is a fantastic story if you like unreliable narrators, if you like books that really delve into complex relationships and that really deconstruct things for the reader, even in the way that the story is told. It's so good. And I also learned a lot from this book, because even though the main character is Indo-Trinidadian, one of the side characters is Indo-Ugandan, and I got to learn a little bit more about like Indian people from Uganda and their history and their struggles and how different it is from like Indo-Caribbean people in general. So it was really interesting to read about that. Definitely highly recommend Polar Vortex by Shani Mootoo. Next up we have Brother by David Chariandy. This is a story about a Trini-Canadian guy who lives with his mom, and he has an older brother who they seem to have a very rocky relationship with. In the present timeline of the story, the brother is not around, and in the past timeline of the story, we're looking at the relationship between him and his brother and their mother as well, and the circumstances that led to him not really being involved in the family anymore. It is a compelling story. It is a extremely sad story. Definitely prepare yourself for this one. And it is one that addresses the very real problem of police brutality, specifically in Toronto. We often talk about police brutality in the context of the United States, but it happens everywhere, including Toronto. And it is a story about how these young black men are navigating that in the context of that particular city. It is a fantastic book and everybody needs to read it. The last two books I have to talk about are classics. The first of which, I should talk about the older one first actually. This is Miguel Street by V.S. Naipaul. This is like a classic Trini book. Like if most Trinidadians have read one book set in Trinidad, it's probably Miguel Street. V.S. Naipaul is our most known and celebrated author, obviously. And Miguel Street is actually based off of Naipaul Street, which is where V.S. Naipaul is from. It's a street in St. James, and the story basically takes place from the perspective of this unnamed young man who's basically V.S. Naipaul himself. It's somewhat semi-autobiographical, and it is about his observations of all of the people on the street. So each chapter is basically like another chapter about a different character on the street. I didn't like Miguel Street. I never liked it. I always found it to be just a really drab book to read. I never found the characters interesting. I mean, I found them interesting, but the way that Naipaul tells the story, something about it just doesn't really work for me. So I don't know if it was the book or if it's just Naipaul in general or if it's me, but I just never really jived with Miguel Street. But obviously, like, you know, if you want to read a very well-known, easy-to-read, short Trini classic that really kind of delves into a lot of our culture, specifically at the time in which this book is set, in the 1930s or 40s, I believe. But in many ways, it's still very relevant to today. I would recommend picking it up still. The final Trini book I have to recommend in this video is another classic. This is The Jumbie Bird by Ismith Khan. This was published in the 60s, but it takes place in the 30s. It is about an Indo-Trinidadian Muslim family living in Port of Spain. We focus specifically on the grandfather of the family. His name is Miguel Khan, who is a proud Pathan who originally came from India during indentureship to Trinidad and is now old and sort of, you know, lost a lot of his valor in life and reminisces a lot on his past, as well as romanticizes and reminisces on his past in India. And he still sort of represented that generation of Indo-Trinidadians who no longer exist, who passed away a long time ago, but who originally came from India, the first generation, the immigrants, right, who came in the 1800s and a little bit after, who would have, you know, created the foundation for, you know, our culture and who we are as a people today. Many of them looked back to India as their homeland and had aspirations of returning, and of course many of them did not. And so the story is about him kind of having those aspirations and reflecting a lot on his life and sort of trying to maintain the mask of his masculinity as this older man. And it revolves around his young grandson who is sort of looking up to him and and wants to be like his grandfather, but also just comes from a different world and is really just trying to understand him. This is such a beautifully written story that really brings to life 1930s Port of Spain. There's so many references in here to Islam as well, even though the family is not super religious, and I don't really think much people, especially back in those days, were very religious, at least not in the way that they are now, specifically with regards to Muslims when it comes to like Orthodox Islam. But Islam was still such a part of their life, as well as their Indian heritage and specifically their Pathan heritage. So it was really interesting to read about all of those things and how it all melded together in the context of 1930s Port of Spain. It was a fantastic book and one of my favorite classics that I've ever read. So there you have it. Those are 6 books set in Trinidad that you should definitely read. Stay tuned for the next installment of this video, which should come out aiming for like the end of September. So stay tuned for that. And check out the first installment in this series if you are interested as well. If you made it to the end of this video, let me know in the comments down below, and you could do that by just leaving an emoji. And I'll leave you to figure out the emoji. Since this is a book about Trinidad, leave something Trinidad related. It could be the flag, could be something else creative that you might think of. So yeah, all of that being said, thank you all ever so much for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.